toxic. And materials involved with this stuff are extremely nasty. Arsenic, being one of the common things in semiconductor doping. I had a student when I taught who went to work for Honeywell building semiconductors. And you know, what they use for cleaning the stuff, it's not phosphoric, hydrofluoric acid. Okay, so hydrofluoric acid is one of these things that, okay, you handle it in a glove and everything with gloves. And if you spill it in your glove, you're not going to get to the emergency wash fountain before.
It's like an Alien, where it's the alien's blood would drill right through the spaceship. If you remember that movie, that's what hydrofluoric acid.
You would not have a hand by the time you got to be able to safely remove the stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that's involved in doing that. And let's see, ion implantings, you know, actually a linear accelerator, and on and on. And you have to be able to do this in a vibration-free clean room. And vibration-free means, like, you go to Silicon Valley and Intel and the other fabs that are there, they are on spring-isolated, shock mount-isolated columns, so even if there's a major earthquake, they don't feel a vibration in the building, because the traffic driving by would be enough to screw up the parts they make.
Okay, thank you. And actually, it's kind of related to my next question, which was about the state of affairs of analog components. Like, we know technology is improving, and I think, I mean, I recently heard, like, analog gear that, I mean, is really, really good. So I was wondering, what is your opinion on, are there more improvements that we can see towards the future, and what are the components that we might have issues with that might get worse, and how do you see this?
We just, you know, do you all know that with power supplies, there's a thing called linear power supplies, where you use a big transformer, from the power coming out of your wall to make other voltages, then you rectify it, and you get that all ready for your circuit. And then there's another thing called switch mode power supplies, which are real little things that you see, like this little brick in front of us here probably. So there's some real advantages to a really good switch mode power supply, namely, you know, you don't have to change the voltage to ship all over the world, and they're lighter, and they're supposed to be cheaper. But most of the time, they're really noisy and really horrible. So in our case, we decided to hire the worldwide expert who knows the most about switch mode power supply design than anyone in the world, and he designed for us a really great, fabulous, built for audio, designed for vacuum tubes, switch mode power supply. And that's really exciting for us, because it's actually superior in every way to our old linear supplies. It's quieter, lower impedance, all the rails are regulated. It wasn't any cheaper, unfortunately, but all the gains are we're so excited about this. So that's a new technology for us. I mean, we're dealing with antique vacuum tubes, and then we've got the latest and greatest, coolest power supply design on the planet.
And it sounds good too. It has the sonic advantage.
So that's one case of looking towards new technology and getting that worked into our antique audio designs. But it works.
Yeah, yes. See, the other, and I did the switch mode thing for the Spider, and we actually, no, it was not cheaper. it was, but it's twice as much power as it used to be, and it's actually quieter.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the guy that did that for me was a former student who did power supplies for missiles for 25 years, so he kind of had a handle on, you know, what was needed for doing it.
But it's also getting necessary. But what we see is that some of the stuff we have been building for 30 years, and we had for many years the same people. We don't do our own transformers. We had a good company to do that. Mm-hmm. But suddenly the good company was bought by a bigger, not so good company. Mm. And suddenly it got worse. And then the guys who built the transformers, because it was the same guys, they got old. They went on a pension. And the new guys, suddenly it was all a mess.
Yeah.
So John Peterson, who designs TubeTech, he had to go and redesign the transformers. The company was not good enough to do that. Mm. So that leads you into finding, that's the troubles we have with a lot of stuff, like we discussed before, quality falling down, stuff gets worse, they want you to buy more, and you cannot rely on it. So it's keeping. We try still. We could just done is kind of conservative to do it the same old way, but that gets harder and harder every day. So there's a need to look for clever modern solution.
Yeah, and see, a thing with surface mount too is you can make the circuit smaller, put the parts closer together, and in a given space you can reduce the interaction between various parts of some of the circuits, because you can keep critical things away from each other because each of the circuits are smaller. And with some other tricks, in circuit design, you can actually get improved performance over through-hole. But it's sometimes a little bit of work to get there, and sometimes, like I said, you lose your hair trying to do it, because you'll have this prototype thing and it works really, really good, and you plug it into the actual product that you're designing and you go, doesn't work so good anymore. Things happen. And you just kind of have to learn how to, solve those problems.
There is another side to it as well. For analog equipment, we use a lot of, we do use different front panel or sometimes back panel, but front panel technology as well. We have hands-on switches, we have hands-on potentiometers, or we control things directly we don't do it through a computer. So by and large, we don't do that, but mostly we use either rotary control or push button or toggle switches, and they are harder to get hold of as well. If you look at rotary switch manufacturers, they will make a switch that has enough position, say a 24 position switch that has got the 15-degree indexing, or if you go to the next step up where you might have 10-degree indexing or 12.5-degree or whatever it might be. There are only so many, maybe that many, or not even that many manufacturers in the world that you can go to. And you can't then thump your and say, if you don't do this for me, I go somewhere else. And they laugh at you and say, who would that be then?
Yeah.
And it could be that we own them too.
Yeah.
So it is very difficult. And the quality is not exactly going up on these things. If anything, they're going down.
Yeah.
And the problem is, so here you have a circuit maybe that works beautifully, and the feel of the switch doesn't work so well. It's like you have 3 switches and they all feel totally different. That we talked about earlier, that the torque is not that it's grindy at places maybe, or it might be bouncing, so and it lasts for like 3 weeks and then you get sort of noise from it. So you're stuck with only so many physical sort of components that you use, sort of that the people who buy it will actually see, never mind what's behind the panel. And again, with surface mount, you could make very small circuits, but the box that we sell will still be determined by how large the knobs are and the controls on the front panel. How small can you make a meter and still be able to read it, and how small is the knob that you turn without being ridiculous. So you have it becomes quite a large box. So for that reason, there isn't really a problem necessarily with the size of the surface mount. It's just a production cost as well, that to put this thing together might be cheaper with labor-wise with a surface mount. But as Dave said, it's very difficult to go from one, after all these years, we know sort of how to do a circuit and make it work, and we know that if I do this, that works. Surface mount is, oh God, all things now is different. What is this going to be like? How long will it take to perfect that? It needs almost a new designer who's grown up with that to think sort of instinctively about it.
And we could add Roash to the list of frustrations, but
It's a lead-free thing. Another thing, as recording styles have changed over the years. Say 20 years ago, I'll take the same piece of equipment we've been making. We had a stereo input control, so left and right channels were on the same potentiometer. And that potentiometer had a 20% tolerance rating from the manufacturer. So if it was a 100K value, 100 kiloohms, it could have it's 80K, or maybe it's 120K or something like that. So left and right would be off a little bit as you turn the pot. Maybe left channel would be a dB louder, and then kind of catch up, and maybe it'd be down half a dB here, whatever. People didn't really care that much about it back 20 years ago. because they were really just listening, and they were watching meters bounce, but it was a different thing than today. So if it was off a little bit and you could hear it, all right, you can hit the output control up a little bit, and you'll have the center image where you're supposed to. These days, what I see going on is a lot of people are really relying on the computer screen, and they're watching the meters on their DAW, on their digital audio workstation. And they're looking at numbers on the screen. And so we start getting calls. Oh my God, this unit, it's a dB louder on the left channel. I want a new one, it's broken. It's like, no. And then, a few years go by. Now we're matching the pots, we're taking them apart, we're measuring them, we're trying to get them to track within a half a dB. And then the calls are coming in. Oh my God, the right channel is louder by half dB. And then we're doing this and that, and finally we just moved to a switch with 1% resistors. And it's terrible because maybe you want to be right in the middle, but the problem is that our customers, are recording with their eyeballs. And you cannot hear that half dB difference anyway, So when you ask, well, why is that thing so expensive? Well, it's because we had to do all this work to make this thing, track perfectly like a computer plug-in. But it's not a computer plug-in. It's analog equipment. It's really time-consuming to select components and match things to make it as perfect as possible. And so, remember that we're in the audio business, and we're supposed to be using our ears to record, not our eyes.
We had the same thing.
That's what I'd like to say.
We had exactly the same thing with the multiband, where we also people looking at the figures, and it's exactly the same thing. I've been working with that, and people who are more old school, they listen to it, and if it's a little off, then they find a way to adjust that. It's nothing, but then people measure. So we had to put in this kind of joke knob, which is like 1 ± 1 dB balance knob, just to make these guys happy.
Yeah.
Well,
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's actually
It's
gotten
ridiculous.
it's gotten worse than that.
And it degraded
Okay,
the unit.
so we all got
I didn't
stations here. How many people do FFT measurements to look at things?
Watch the spectrum analyzer bounce around as you
Oh,
record.
good, nobody in here, that's a good thing, because,
There-
because
no, there's someone's lying.
most people,
Someone's
yeah, probably, but, because most people who do FFT measurements don't have a clue as to what it means. And they'll go, well, there's this 16K spike here, and I can hear it out in my driveway when the system's left on and I'm coming home. Well, at what level it is? Well, it's about a minus 130 dB.
You're right.
And it's like, but that's the kind of things. I get emails like this all the time of, yeah, but this measurement says this, and it says the noise floor is like minus 75 when I turn on all of this stuff. Well, can you hear it? Probably not. Does it really mean anything? Well, maybe not. But I see this. What is it? Mark of the Unicorn. They give you an FFT thing, I think, with their box. There's a
I think
couple.
it's thrown in free with every product nowadays. You get a
Pretty much
FFT
every
of
one
some
of
type.
Yeah, because most people have, they think it's the ultimate measuring thing, and it's like, unless you know how to interpret it and realize how it lies to you, because you can use it to show spectrum of two different things, and it will match, and they'll sound completely different.
But then if you, like, with the sound, that people forget to listen, is it a pleasant sound?
Yeah.
Does it make
Yeah,
you
well,
happy?
there
Does
is-
it
there is-
create
you-
some joy?
The business is obviously split up into different areas, sort of what we sell to and what we do. I mean, I come from recording, mixing. I've done a little bit of discutting and mastering, but a lot of recording and mixing. I love recording more than any of the other things because this is the creative part of it. The rest is kind of housekeeping after that and making sure that hiding all what you didn't achieve maybe doing the recording. I don't know about you. How many of you are mixers? Are mixing records or songs? Because what we're talking about now has become very, I understand, very important about the recallability. Because when you're mixing records today, you're used to that within your Pro Tools or whatever you use, you get an exact recall of everything except the analog output gear that you're using. And if you can't, I get that a lot from people. They weak link of being able to put in that, and at a cost, again, you don't get paid for what you used to. You have to do things quickly. You're supposed to be able to put this back in again and only make a minute change, or having it exactly like before. The only difference is that you might have redone one of the backing vocals or something on it. And if you can't reset the output gear, i.e. the analog pieces of equipment which is not under computer control accurately, the mix will fall apart anyway. It won't sound the same. It was different, but the nearest you got in with the all analog was like the SSL Total Recall, which was not precisely exact. It was sort of roughly the same, but it wasn't. You knew that it wasn't going to be 100% okay. Therefore, you were less critical about the output gear. But today, if you're using computers or if you control mixing, you're used to that everything is precisely the same as before except the output gear. And if you have potentiometers, never mind that left and right, never mind that, but can you set it at about 10 o'clock, and maybe that's plus minus a few dB or even 1 dB. That will make a difference to the mix, won't it? So that is a challenge today, and that maybe makes people focus more on what's wrong with being able to get the same signal as before, because it actually is a problem, a real problem, and which has nothing to do with whether you like it or not. But so there is that side to it too.
But then that way of working suddenly decides the quality people are using, because they fall into, well, then we use these plugins, because then we can record.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
suddenly our beautiful, nice vintage or whatever analog equipment is not being used.
Yeah, but I've got a friend who's got a mix room, it's a beautiful mix room, and he's got a huge Pro Tools rig, and he must have about 100 odd converters that are just patch points. So he has an I/O for every piece of analog equipment he's got, which is probably in the region of 100 channels worth of analog equipment. And every one of them has a dedicated D to A and A to D. So it's plugged in straight, and it does all the patching is done with the computers. It never patches anything physically, but it has to reset those. And they have to be recall sheets. He loves step controls, I tell you, because even though he's in between maybe the ideal, at least they will be the same next time.
But I must say, I've done with my work now, doing more promotional work, I have more time than when I was running a recording studio. So I have time to take projects. I've done a little research into people's projects, well-known mixers, with stuff known for being pretty good at their stuff, also with records being mastered for a lot of money. And I have several projects I travel with where I take everything out, I remove every single plugin, and make a very, very simple mix, and treat it with whatever simple mastering tools. And very often, as a matter of fact, all the times I've done it, the results comes out much better, which is weird, because then my solution was simple, with using few right tools, and then it was not that hard. Then of course you have to record by taking a snapshot or something. But it's crazy to see how much people get into using, because it's easier on the computer. Click plugin, click one more plugin, and this one, and then it adds to up a lot of digital processing, which I feel I can prove that's not the way to go. But a lot of people do that.
Yeah, but
Even very high level pro.
But that is just easier than it used to be. I remember well, sort of in the analog, where everything was analog. I mean, it might be a digital tape recorder in there, but the whole room was analog. It was going through analog racks, like sort of a traditional control room is. And the bass, as soon as the bass drum hit, was sort of, or the drummer hit the bass drum, you could see flashing lights going around the whole room. This thing was going through all these boxes. And if you compare the beginning of what it came off the mic and the end result, wasn't that much difference. But still, it had to go all through all this, possibly because it sounded much more consistent before there were any samplers that you could use. But still, we can talk all day about the people who do that are the ones that have to change. If they like to work like that, they'll work like that, no matter what we tell them.
Well, I threw a guy out of my office the other day who was trying to buy some more gear, and he didn't quite have enough money for an EQ that he wanted or whatever. I'm like, you know what? Just stop buying gear. You haven't even recorded one note with this stack of gear that you bought 2 months ago. He's just been on a equipment purchasing mission because he's got a lot of money, but he's never recorded anything. I said, go learn how to record first and then get on the gear. You know, you don't need all this gear to record. You need to learn how to record, get some skills.
Yeah, there's a couple things that happens with the plug-in scenario. With some people, it is, I can do this, so I should. Okay, and they do, and when you get their mix, they bring you their song for you to mix. You remove all the plugins, because the same thing is true in the digital world as it was in the analog world. The less crap in the signal path, the better it sounds. And that still really holds. The other thing is, the reality is, the compressor plugins don't sound as good. The EQ plugins, even the best ones, can be workable, but they really don't sound as good as a good external analog EQ. They just don't. And if you do real critical listening, and which is a whole, and this is a whole nother discussion, accuracy of monitors, so you can actually believe what you are hearing, and we could get into this for hours on that. And with a side note, subwoofers don't work, so you got to have full range speakers, and it also interacts with your acoustics and all these things. But if you have a really accurate monitoring system, which is what you need first, so you can actually and know that you can believe what you're hearing, you will hear these things that the more crap in there, the crappier it sounds. And you'll find that the less processing you do, the less compression. You know, if you got a nice acoustic space, you won't have to do as much EQ, and all of a sudden you end up with a mix, and it sparkles and it shines and it has space in it, and Dave goes to master it, and it's wonderful sounding afterwards, as opposed to bringing him square waves with too much bottom and expecting him to fix it.
Yeah, I think that, again, it doesn't matter how good your speakers are, it doesn't matter how many good compressors or how non-compressor you have. You've got to know what you want it to sound like, not just knowing what it sounds like. So when do you know that it's great, or when do you know that it's wrong? And it's only because you know what it should sound like, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I find that is one of the big things that people haven't, I mean, they lost their own taste. Maybe they just are followers, not leaders in that sense.
You go out on gear sluts and you want to learn the opinion. Well, gee, I need to compress all my drums. It's like, why?
Yeah.
But that's what gear sluts tells you.
Yeah.
So the people come in to the stand at the show at NAMM or AES or whatever. Well, I need enough compressor channels to handle all my drums. And it's like, why do you need that? Well, because that's what it said on gear sluts. Well, you know, that's not really the step about making a good recording. Let's figure out what you really need and what you're really trying to do first. And then we can determine whether you actually need a compressor for your drums or not. And being a compressor manufacturer, that's sort of a weird thing to tell somebody who's looking to buy them, but, you know, that's the reality.
But what's wrong with one good compressor instead of 10 shitty compressors?
Well, then
Sometimes that's a good solution.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't even need one. You just need it to get it. You know, it's not necessarily, the presumption isn't that you need to compress. You only compress because you need to compress, you know, not because that's what you
should be doing.
You should be doing. That's
Yeah.
the one thing that is going wrong with a lot. This is what they read about something and you don't know who said that, why did they say it. So, I mean, for any kind of music, classical music, jazz music, pop music, hip hop, what music is it? No, we compress with 10 compressors.
But if you look at pop music or classic soul, old souls, reference for a lot of stuff today, it has been heavily compressed in a simple way.
Beyond
so that's kind of the thing a lot of people look at and wonder how did they do that?
Yeah, well, it's not music anymore; it's technology at that
Well,
point.
they only did it because they could. Is what's the answer you
Oh,
get.
yeah,
And
but
that
yeah.
is That's the only true answer.
But the way they could do it is not the way people do it today, because they do it on emulations, digital emulations of what they did.
But I mean, go back and look at the consoles there. I mean, you've got a compressor in every channel.
Mm.
We've had that since, what, early 70s, that would be consoles with a compressor on every channel. Did that mean that everything was too much compressed? Sometimes yes, sometimes not. But I think that it's what the music, I think the lack of all this is that the music doesn't dictate what you do. Sort of, it sounds to me like, you know, everyone has an opinion about how you should record without relating back to, but what does that song or that piece of music dictate that you do?
But
That is the
another
biggest
thing that's
difference.
interesting when you mention that, I think that goes for us with what we do, is that particular brand of console in the 70s. When you had facilities, suddenly you had recall, suddenly you had computer mix.
Yeah.
But you also had a console where some of the money for the sound making part of it went into the control circuits, and suddenly the EQs didn't sound well, and that was when the Pultecs took off. That was because of those SSL series, because people couldn't get the high frequency sounding nice, so they found that all vintage tube stuff. And now that's been, we see exactly the same thing happening now with digital. When young people who never heard the beauty of a passive EQ, the simple stuff you can build, they go nuts because they never experienced something as pleasant as that.
There is another thing as well. If you are in a studio and you have a console where you can see clearly where the knobs are pointing, you can see that everything is whacked up or down like this. Perhaps the singer or whoever will look at that and say, "Is that my channel? Why are the controls so weird on that EQ? Is that what you do to my?" But when it's in the computer, you can't really see what you've done. You know, you might be, but normally it's hidden away, so you can't see. It's not so intimidating as it will be with analog when you have extreme settings on everything. So the controls on an analog piece of equipment does two things. It changes what it is, but it tells you what it's the display at the same time. You know, and this is part of I think that you can do too much easily on plugins and other things because you're not quite so aware of what you're doing.
Okay. Thanks. My next question is about what I've seen a lot as a teacher is that students nowadays, they understand less and less about signal flow because you have Pro Tools and you just click a button and signal is there. So I wonder how that relates to the analog gear. How many people, let's say they want to do mastering, properly calibrate their system? Do they know what the headroom is in the equipment they buy? Like, what is your feeling about that?
Well, I think it's certainly a problem in a lot of cases, and gain structure didn't go away because digital audio workstations appeared. Operating levels are still important. We were talking earlier about people running excessive levels inside the workstation and seeing a lot of red lights on the meters. You'll get a better mix, and you'll get a mix that actually masters better if you run your levels low. And if the peak level that you present the stereo mix at is at -20, seems very low. It'll sound much better than a mix that's peaking at 0 all the time. There's a phenomenon called intersample peaking, which is actually causing clipping inside the workstation itself, even in floating point frame. And you can have, I guess you could go back and say that gain structure never went away. It became easier to operate at the wrong level in digital, where in analog you might be fighting headroom clipping, noise floor. There was more of a sweet spot. But digital also has a sweet spot, and lower is better than louder. And it's easy to do an experiment with your workstation because you can master trim everything down and see what you think. See if that mix where you had a lot of red lights blinking everywhere and the plugins were clipping and the Pro Tools meters were in the yellow to red zone, trim everything down a lot. Trim it down 20 dB, whack the monitor volume up 20 dB, and see what you think. I think it's a very illuminating experiment to try. Costs nothing, takes 5 minutes, and see what you think. Now, as far as operating levels in the analog world, that hasn't really changed. The headroom of analog gear has been pretty much the same for a long time. You might have tube gear that has very high maximum output levels, yay, tubes, but at the same time, attention to gain structure throughout the signal path is just as important now. Digital has actually kind of made it worse in some respects because the idea of headroom and operating level is confusing to a lot of engineers, even experienced engineers. You'll find a lot of misconceptions about what is, what do I call 0? Do I call 0 minus 18 for plus 4 dBu? What is my operating level? What is the right operating level? And I think probably as an instructor, you've come up against a lot of misconceptions, a lot of need to define a little more accurately what operating level is.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes.
What do you find when you are teaching?
Well, not only as a teacher, but also, for example, as a studio and having interns come into the studio and they not fully understanding how you calibrate an analog signal chain, even that. And yeah, I just, there seem to be a lot of misconceptions about, well, basically what they think is you just need the analog gear and you just plug in the XLR, have the XLR come out and not worry about it as they think in digital. I think that is one of the main key aspect is that they don't even think about, okay, it needs to be at a good level. And I just think the fact that they forget to think about gain structure, I think that's the main key. Not to know really what level to put it at, that is the next step, but to actually just forget that it's necessary.
Yeah, because in analog studios, in a studio like you have next door, any of these rooms, there really was a sweet spot for the operating level, and you would always find that there was a place the console wanted to operate at. Now maybe in that old SSL, it's with the stereo bus meter slamming. When I go in most SSL rooms, when you walk in, it's pretty hot. There's some saturation effect in stereo bus. People like the sound of it, but there is a operating level for almost any piece of gear that it is happier.
But isn't it also, I've been wondering, I'm not that technical, so I don't know how that has evolved, but I've never been able to find any information. So in the old days, it was like first generation digital was, over 0, goodbye. But now you can just crank it up, and whatever is made, how are the systems made to act? Of course, it's not analog, but they just distort in an awful way. So you can have red lights all over the place without having horrible noises. It just sounds shitty in a different way.
Sometimes there's horrible noises, and I'm wondering, how did anyone responsible ever release that record that way? There's a Carpenter's Greatest Hits that was actually Dave mastered the original one like 20 years ago, or